Everybody has problems, even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless. God bless. You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's exactly
Remember this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
Donald Trump irreparably destroyed the 80-year-old post-World War II international order. His total abandonment of Ukraine in front of the cameras was on display for the entire world to see. It was a truly historic moment, not in the good way.
All right, so today we're diving into something pretty intense. This meeting with Trump and Pence and Zelenskyy. Chris Hayes actually called it a total game changer for the world order.
Wow, yeah.
And, we've got the segment from his show. And he really doesn't hold back. He says this meeting basically broke everything. So are you ready to get into it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this meeting, it wasn't just, another news cycle blip. It was like watching tectonic plates shift. And what I think is so fascinating about it is how much it reveals about how the world actually works.
Yeah.
Behind all the official statements and all the, diplomatic dances.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so right away you can feel the tension.
Yeah.
Hayes points out that Trump just seems annoyed with Zelenskyy.
He's not speaking loudly. He's not speaking loudly. Your country's in big trouble.
Can I
Wait a
answer?
minute. No. You've done a lot of talking. Your country is in big trouble.
I know.
You're not winning.
I know.
You're not winning this. You have a damn good chance of coming out okay because of us.
Mr. President, we are staying in our country, staying strong from the very beginning of the war. We've been alone, and we are thankful. I said thanks
you haven't
in
been
this
alone.
cabinet,
You
and
haven't
not
been
only
alone.
in this cabinet.
We gave you, through this stupid
you.
president, $350 billion.
Like he expects him to be way more deferential to Putin.
Oh, yeah, that's a huge red flag. For decades, American foreign policy has been all about building coalitions, working with allies based on, shared values goals. But here, Trump is just tossing all that out the window. He's fixated on these strongman personalities. He's putting personal relationships over strategic alliances. And we saw this throughout his presidency. And honestly, it was a pretty radical departure from how things have always been done.
Yeah, it's true. And, I remember watching this live and being floored when Zelenskyy pleads with Trump about Putin. He straight up says, he is a killer and terrorist. I hope that we can stop him.
I mean, talk about a desperate call for help.
Right. And, you'd expect maybe some show of support, some reassurance from Trump, something.
Mm-hmm.
But he basically shrugs it off. He's saying that Zelenskyy's hatred for Putin is making it hard to make deals. It's like he's blaming the victim. And he completely undermines Zelenskyy on the world stage. It sends this message that the U.S. isn't really there for its allies.
Totally. And it gets worse. Just when you think it can't get more awkward, Pence jumps in.
It's like a 2-on-1 situation in the Oval Office. You hear Pence actually say to Zelenskyy, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media right now. I was speechless.
He killed our people, and he didn't exchange prisoners. We signed the exchange of prisoners, but he didn't do it. What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Come once.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President.
I know that moment is truly chilling because it's not just about disrespecting Zelenskyy at that point. It's this public display of the U.S. throwing its weight around, silencing a wartime ally who's looking for support. I mean, imagine how this played in Moscow, watching the U.S. undercut its own partner like that.
Yeah, it's crazy. They even played another clip where Trump says, you should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict. It's like, not only is he not getting support, Zelensky's being told he should be grateful.
Exactly. It really highlights this transactional worldview that Trump brought to foreign policy. It was never about shared values. It was always about, what can you do for me? And this wasn't some backroom deal. This was for the world to see. Think about the message that this sends to other countries watching this. Can they rely on the U.S.? Can they trust American promises?
It makes you think.
Yeah.
And then there's this weird moment, almost comical if it weren't so serious, where Trump starts bragging about giving Zelenskyy javelins while Obama only gave sheets. Like,
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting, because it's not just a random Trumpian quip. If you think about it symbolically, javelins are offensive weapons. You use them to attack. Sheets, on the other hand, are defensive. You use them for protection. So the seemingly offhand comment actually reveals a potential shift in U.S. involvement. Is America now pushing Ukraine towards a more aggressive stance? Is this about containing Russia, or is it about something more?
it feels like this whole meeting was about Trump pushing this raw earth deal on Zelenskyy. He kept saying it's a quid pro quo for U.S. support. What even is a raw earth deal?
Well, a raw earth deal probably refers to agreements related to the mining and extraction of rare earth elements. These are crucial components for all sorts of high-tech industries. And they're found in abundance in certain parts of the world. And control over their supply can have, major economic and strategic implications. So essentially what Trump was suggesting was tying U.S. support for Ukraine to securing access to these valuable resources.
So not just military support, but trying to get a piece of Ukraine's natural resources too. That's bold.
It certainly is, and it raises some serious ethical questions, too. Is it appropriate for the U.S. to leverage its position as a global power, to pressure another country into deals that primarily benefit U.S. economic interests? What does that say about, the U.S., its commitment to democratic values and the rule of law?
Wow. This is already a lot to think about. I feel like we're just scratching the surface here.
Yeah, you're right. This meeting is just the tip of the iceberg. The real story is what it reveals about the shifting dynamics of global power and the potential for a much more fractured world order.
Okay, so before we move on, I have to ask, what was your reaction when you first saw this whole exchange unfold?
Honestly, I was stunned. It felt like watching the foundations of the post-World War II order just crumble before my eyes. Everything we thought we knew about international relations, about alliances, about America's role in the world, it all seemed to be up for grabs.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate how much this meeting shook things up. But before we dive into the aftermath and what it all means, let's take a closer look at what happened next in that Oval Office meeting.
Problem is, I've empowered you to be a tough guy. And I don't think you'd be a tough guy without the United States. And your people are very brave. But you're either going to make a deal or we're out. And if we're out, you'll fight it out. I don't think it's going to be pretty, but you'll fight it out. But you don't have the cards. But once we sign that deal, you're in a much better position. But you're not acting at all thankful. And that's not a nice thing. I'll be honest, that's not a nice thing. All right, I think we've seen enough.
So Zelensky's in the Oval Office getting pressure from both Trump and Pence. And this whole raw earth deal is just hanging in the air.
Yeah.
What happened next?
Well, it didn't end well. Zelenskyy refused to sign. And from what we know, he was basically escorted out of the White House.
Wait, they kicked him out?
Pretty much, yeah. And the planned press conference was immediately canceled.
Seriously?
Yeah, it gets weirder. Later, Trump is quoted as saying that Zelenskyy needed to say positive things about Putin.
Oh, come on.
Right. I mean, remember, this is after Zelenskyy just called Putin a killer and terrorist to his face.
It's like Trump was more worried about Putin's feelings than supporting a Democratic ally who was under attack.
Yeah, it all goes back to what we were talking about before. Trump's foreign policy was driven by these personal dynamics. And his admiration for Putin was no secret. So it makes you wonder, was U.S. foreign policy really being dictated by personal whims instead of, strategic national interests?
When you see the hatred he's got for Putin, it's very tough for me to make a deal with that kind of hate.
It's a scary thought. So how did everyone react to this whole thing? It must have been a complete disaster.
It was a mess. The reactions were completely divided. You had people like Rubio and Graham praising Trump, saying he was being tough and putting America first.
Yeah, that America first agenda.
Yeah.
Which I guess in this case meant putting Ukraine's resources first.
Right, exactly. But then on the other side, you had European allies rallying around Zelenskyy. They condemned Trump's actions and said they still supported Ukraine.
So even America's closest allies were siding against the U.S. president.
Yeah. And that's a huge problem. Remember how we talked about the post-World War II order being built on this idea of collective security and international cooperation? Well, this meeting was like a wrecking ball to that whole system. It exposed these deep cracks in the U.S.-European alliance, and it made everyone question whether America was really committed to its allies.
And Chris Hayes takes it even further, right? He says that what Trump was doing, aligning himself with these authoritarian leaders like Putin, was actually creating something worse than what came before.
That's right. And it's a terrifying thought, Because the post-World War II order, for all its problems, it at least gave us a framework, for managing international relations, for resolving disputes, for preventing another huge war. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And by undermining that order, by siding with autocrats over Democrats, Trump basically created this vacuum, this power void that could be filled by something much more dangerous.
So what could that be? What does a world without that order even look like?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's impossible to say for sure. But we can look at history. When powerful countries retreat, when the rules are ignored, when alliances fall apart, it often leads to instability and conflict, and the rise of extremism. Think about the time between the two world wars. Economic turmoil, political upheaval, and ultimately another global war.
That's pretty scary. It feels like we're on the edge of something totally unpredictable, like we've stepped off a cliff and we don't know what's at the bottom.
That's a good way to put it. We're in uncharted territory. The old rules don't apply anymore, and the future is completely uncertain. We've seen how fast things can change, how one event can set off a chain reaction with global consequences. This meeting was a wake-up call, a reminder that the world is this complex, interconnected system, and our actions have huge implications.
Wow, there's a lot to think about here. I mean, it's like we've uncovered this hidden fault line running through the world, and this meeting was the earthquake that exposed it.
And
What stands out to you as the most significant thing from all of this?
I think for me, it's just the boldness of it all. The way that decades of, these diplomatic norms and these protocols were just casually tossed aside. This wasn't just some subtle policy shift. This was a blatant, power play, like a declaration that the old rules just didn't matter anymore.
Yeah, and it wasn't just Trump. I mean, Pence was right there with him the whole time, reinforcing this idea that America was going to do whatever it wanted.
Yeah, you're right. And that's what makes it so dangerous. It's not about, one president or one administration. It's about a fundamental shift in how power is being used on the world stage.
Right. Some people might say this is just classic Trump, like all bluster and showmanship, and that it doesn't really represent a real change in American policy. What would you say to that?
I think the evidence speaks for itself. This wasn't just talk, it was action. Zelenskyy was kicked out. The press conference was canceled. Trump even publicly demanded that Zelenskyy praise Putin. These weren't empty threats. They were concrete actions with real consequences.
Yeah, it's like watching a house of cards collapse, one card at a time. You have the U.S.-European alliance fracturing, the post-World War II order crumbling.
Yeah.
And this feeling that anything goes now. It's a lot to process.
It really is. And it raises these uncomfortable questions about the future. What happens when personal relationships and power dynamics become the driving force behind international relations? What happens to democratic values and the rule of law when they're seen as obstacles to overcome?
This whole deep dive has been incredibly insightful. But I'm not going to lie, it's also been pretty unsettling.
I get that. It's not easy to think about, The possibility that the world we thought we knew is changing in ways that we can't control. But that's why it's so important to be aware of these issues, to understand how everything works, and to think critically about what it all means.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think we're left with this one big question. What does the future hold for a world where, personal relationships and power are at the center of international affairs? What does it mean for countries like Ukraine? What does it mean for the U.S.?
Those are the questions we all need to be asking. And while the answers are tough to find, one thing is clear. We can't just sit back and watch. We need to stay informed. We need to talk about these things. And we need to hold our leaders accountable, because the future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something that we create through our actions and our choices.
Well said. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive.